There, you're calming down. So, just want to welcome you on behalf of West End United Methodist Church. We're so glad that we're able to host this event. And a few things. The restrooms for this room are located. The women's is in the back corner to the left. The men's is you just turn right, right by the registration, and it's right there on the right. You also, and Paul's going to tell you more about the workshops from the third floor. There are elevators. There are two elevators. You passed both of them when you came in. If you take the elevator to the third floor, there should be signs that will show you which way the workshops are, which way the bathrooms are. Also, you can take the stairs. So just know, and he'll tell you more about the workshops in a moment. There are a couple of refreshments. There's coffee and tea in the back and some water. And also lunch will be served in this room on the schedule. So that's, I think, all you need to know about that. And do want to mention that there's a quilt. See this beautiful quilt? And we want to thank Betty Krugman for her beautiful handiwork. This is available for auction. We're auctioning off. We are asking for a $100 minimum bid. I think it's worth much more than that, and all of the funds will go to support Tennessee Interfaith Power and Light. So hopefully you'll wander up here, and the bid sheet is right here on the piano. So look at that. So as we begin our day, I'm going to share a prayer by Helen Weaver that I think is appropriate as we start this morning before I turn it over to Paul. One other thing, West End members, you'll see a couple of them in the green recycle shirts. Ask me, I know Bonnie's here somewhere, and Susan, y'all raise your hands. There's Bonnie in the back, Susan back here, Karen McIntyre. So just ask any of us if you need to know where something is, because I know especially on the third floor, you'll get turned around. Let us pray. Oh, our Mother, the earth, blessed is your name. Blessed are your fields and forests, your rocks and mountains, your grasses and trees and flowers, and every green and growing thing. Blessed are your streams and lakes and rivers, the oceans where our life began, and all your waters that sustain our bodies and refresh our souls. Blessed is the air we breathe, your atmosphere that surrounds and binds us to every living thing. Blessed are all your creatures who walk along your surface or swim in your waters or fly through your air, for they are all our relatives. Blessed are all your people who share this planet, for we are all one family, and the same Spirit moves through us all. Blessed is the sun, our day star, bringer of the morning and the heat of the summer, giver of light and life. Blessed is the moon, our night lamp, ruler of the tides, protector of all, and guardian of all our dreams. Blessed are the stars and planets, the timekeepers who fill our nights with beauty and our hearts with awe. O great Spirit, whose voice we hear in the wind and whose face we see in the morning sun, blessed is your name. Help us to remember that you are everywhere and teach us the way of peace. Amen.
Thank you, Lisa. That was a beautiful prayer, and we thank you and West End United Methodist Church and all of the volunteers from West End who are here today for welcoming us here. We are really grateful. It's a lot of work to be hosting something like this. Well, good morning. My name is Paul Slentz, and I am a United Methodist pastor here in Nashville, appointed to the Ministry of Creation Care and Environmental Justice with the Creation Care Ministry of the Tennessee Conference of the United Methodist Church. I also serve on the State Steering Committee of Tennessee Interfaith Power and Light, which from here on, so it's kind of long, so it's TIPL. TIPL is Tennessee Interfaith Power and Light. And also with Dan Duranko. Dan, are you here? Dan's over here, co-coordinator with Dan Duranko with the local chapter here in Nashville. There's also a strong chapter in Nashville, in Knoxville, and a growing one in Chattanooga. I want to also just add my welcome to y'all, in addition to Lisa's, on behalf of TIPL and also the Cumberland Harpeth Audubon Society, which is one of the main sponsors of this event. And there are also 16 other groups and houses of worship who made gifts to co-sponsor this conference. I'm not going to take time to read all of them, but they are in the program that you got. And we are all delighted that you are here. And those of us who have been working on this since May, we've got a good, strong group of people, and that's one of the reasons why we got a good turnout today. And I just would like for everybody who is either on the planning committee or representing one of the sponsoring groups or organizations, if you would please just stand right now, those of you who have been part of the planning committee, and if we could just give them a thank you for really worked hard. Networking is one of the goals of this conference, so we are glad to have representatives of many different organizations here this morning with their displays along the wall, and I hope you've gotten a chance to say hi to them. And they will also, many of them anyway, will still be here during the lunch hour. In my leadership role with Tipple, it would be wrong of me to not take this opportunity to make a special plug for Tennessee Interfaith Power and Light. We would love for you to become a member. It's a very easy thing. There are no dues. We may need to change that at some point, but it doesn't cost anything. It just means that you're supportive of our work in terms of working on climate change and environmental justice and of just care for the earth generally. And our table's over that way. Andrew Hamlet's standing over there. Don't go now. But you just sign up and check the box that says I'd like to be a member, and that's all there is to it. The other thing is that we do like to have different faith communities, different houses of worship to be faith partners. And again, there are no dues, but it just means that you're supportive of our work. And I was about to say who all are members right now, but I'm sure I'll forget somebody. But I know Second Presbyterian, Glendale Baptist Church, Edgehill United Methodist Church, and Unity of Music City, and the Amos House are our current faith community members, and so we hope you will consider that as well. Yes? Oh, okay, and just, Andy, just that we, at the Tipple table, we have postcards to Senator Bob Corker about saying that we want to stay in the Paris Climate Agreement, and ask you to just put your name and zip code on there, and then why on the back of it, but then just leave the cards on the table, so we'll collect those and present them all together. And Andrew just wanted to remind me of that. Okay, so just a few words about today. As the name of Sacred Home Faith Communities Caring for Our Earth implies, the purpose of this conference is to encourage and equip those of you who are here from different houses of worship to go back to your faith communities with what you will be learning today, and share that with them, and try to get more things going there for care for the earth, care for this beautiful, wonderful gift that we have. And so that's the primary purpose, and I hope that you will feel inspired to do that. For those of you who may not be with a particular house of worship, more here just as an individual, we also think that the different talks and workshops and so forth will be of value to you as you are on your own more individual walk to care for this work, for this earth. And by the way, one thing that I was very excited about is that we've got 42 different congregations represented here today, and I think that that's a truly wonderful thing. So thank you all. Yeah. So to these ends of encouragement and equipment, we will be hearing from Reverend Fletcher Harper, who I'll introduce in just a second. And then there will be 3 short testimonials from persons representing congregations who are doing earth care activities. We could have had more, but we didn't have the time. So just a few additional notes about the workshops. Hopefully everybody got I guess it's goldenrod, is the color of the sheets that describes the workshops. And you will see on there that there are 4 tracks that kind of follow what we thought were some of the main aspects of what was involved in earth care in a house of worship. And that's why we came up with the idea of tracks. And as Lisa said earlier, all of the workshops are on the 3rd floor, and you just go back out into the hallway, and if you go to the right, you can walk up the stairs, go to the left, and there are 2 elevators, and then there are instructions pointing the right direction of the workshop rooms once you get up there. They're all just right next to each other, the rooms up there. Okay, and I do want to just thank all of the workshop leaders who are here today. And could you please stand, and let's thank all of you who are here today. Everybody who's leading the workshop today. Okay, we're just so glad that you're here today. I want to introduce our keynote speaker now, Reverend Fletcher Harper. Fletcher is an Episcopal priest who served in the local parish for 10 years in New Jersey, and he is now executive director of Green Faith, one of the leading international interfaith earth care organizations. He has been with Green Faith for the past 15 years, and almost all of that he has been the executive director. Did I just lose? Yeah. Okay, it's back. Okay. And in the past few years, Fletcher has coordinated the 2015 Our Voices campaign, which mobilized religious support globally for the Paris climate talks. He also led the organizing of faith communities for the People's Climate Marches in New York a few years ago, and just this last spring in Washington, D.C., that hundreds of thousands of people took part in. He helped lead the faith-based fossil fuel divestment movement, supported the launch of the global Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, and co-founded SHINE, a campaign to mobilize faith communities, foundations, and NGOs to invest in distributed renewable energy in energy-poor regions of the world. Currently, he is working with faith groups across the country to press states and localities to step up their climate efforts in advance of a major climate conference in September of 2018 focused on subnational actors, and he'll probably say more about that in a few minutes. As you can see, he has been busy. He's been busy for sure. Fletcher has won many awards for his work and is author of Green Faith, Mobilizing God's People to Protect the Earth. And you can, of course, find that on the internet to order copies of that. Above all, as my old pastor, who many of you knew, Bill Barnes, who died recently, would say that above all, Fletcher is a cog, a child of God, and is trying to live faithfully, and is doing so that in tremendous ways for care for this earth. And so please, would you join me in welcoming Fletcher Harper.
Well, good morning. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much, Paul, for your welcome and for the hospitality, and congratulations to you all for this pretty remarkable turnout. It's not easy to organize events like this and to have this number of people willing to come together and to share a Saturday together is really, really remarkable. So give your all selves a round of applause for being here. It's really spectacular. And I want to thank you also. I was speaking at an event out in Colorado a couple of years ago, and when it was announced that I was an environmentalist from New Jersey, people actually started to laugh. And you guys didn't, and so that's to your credit. I appreciate it very, very much. And to get these sort of other starting points out of the way, I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm a Yankee, I'm a New Yorker, and so I speak awfully fast. And if it's going too fast, just start waving or something like that, and I'll do my best to slow it down. I lived for a couple of years in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, many, many years ago, and sort of realized that there are some differences in speech patterns between our different parts of the country. And so I'll do my best, and I'll appreciate your intervention if need be. Paul and I talked a bunch about what would be most useful in terms of what I have to say. And we talked about the fact that a lot of you and a lot of all of us deal in contexts and in circumstances where people think that the work that we're all gathered around today is just flat out insane or wrong, and that represents a challenge that all of us on some level have to reckon with. And so we thought that it might be useful to talk about ways of communicating with people about this work. And so I'm going to share a little bit of a story about some research and some experience that we've had about what kinds of messages seem to connect well. And also, to be honest, what I'm going to do is share a bunch of stories about the growth of this religious environmental movement internationally. Because I think that in this point in time where we are with you-know-who running the show in Washington, D.C., it's really it's important to sort of have a sense of what do we do in the midst of a pretty challenging and difficult time. A small book that I read years ago in seminary was called The Dark Interval. I don't know if any of the pastors or lay leaders who are here have read that. It was by a very appealing, short, fiery Irish Catholic writer named Dominic John Crossan. And he talked about the dark interval as this moment in time where the way in which we make sense of things just totally sort of shatters and crumbles, and there's sort of no way of understanding what the pathway forward from that point is. And he was writing as a Christian and talking about the crucifixion of Jesus as one of those moments. And I'd suggest that we're in one of those dark interval moments right now on a number of different levels. And so I hope that the combination of the narratives that I'm going to share and also the stories that I'm going to tell will help make some difference for you all in relationship to that. And what I'm going to try to do, and this is the good side of the fast-talking New Yorker, what I'm going to try to do is do that in a half hour so we can have 15 minutes for some back and forth, because I think that one of the things that is probably least useful in life is to have New Yorkers standing up in front of large numbers of people talking endlessly. And so I'm going to try to move through quickly and then have some time for some conversation. So does that sound all right? That sound good? Sorry. So here we go. So the messages. So a couple of years ago, in the lead up to the Paris Climate Agreement, we were trying to figure out how to reach people of different faiths, and we were looking at a number of the largest religious traditions globally. So Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and we put Judaism in the mix because it's tremendously influential in relationship to its modest size globally. And we did some research with a wonderful guy in the UK named George Marshall, who specializes in trying to understand about how to communicate about the environment and climate change with audiences that don't normally talk about it and don't normally care about it, or may even have real suspicion about it. And he's done a lot of work with center-right political parties across Europe and in different parts of the world. And so George organized a series of focus groups that we did in the greater London area. When we chose London, we wanted to have a place where we could get a truly global representation of people. And so there are really only a couple of cities in the world that have this combination of real serious religious and cultural diversity and large numbers of recent immigrants. And London is one of those places. And since George was based in the UK, it was cheaper to do it there. So we gathered folks in London. And George did separate focus groups for Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist communities. And he did this wonderful method where he invited people just to talk first about their own core values, totally divorced from the environment. What do they believe was most important and was most dear to them in terms of their own values? And then the second hour of the conversation, he had them talk about what their thoughts were about protecting and caring for the environment. What was important about that order, which I think it's worth remembering, is that he started with what do people believe in genuinely and positively right from the start. He didn't start with the environment. He started with what do people really believe in. And the reason for that, and I think most good preachers know this, is that before you're going to ask people to do something that may feel difficult to them, you got to ask them to do something easy, which is to agree with something that they already agree with. Because the only way you get people, think about a horse trying to jump over a hurdle. The only way you're going to get over that hurdle is if you've got a little good head of steam going into it. If you try to sort of jump over a hurdle when you're at a standstill, it's not going to go too well, and you're more likely than not to trip and get hurt. So at any rate, that was the method that he used. And what emerged was really, I thought, an absolutely beautifully articulated sort of set of narratives or set of messages that we have found work well and that resonated with our experience, but that were put really beautifully. A lot of the communications research on faith and the environment, it has been disproportionately focused on the evangelical Christian community here in the US. And it's been an interesting sort of thing because a number of liberal environmental funders many of whom can't stand organized religion to start with, have realized that they have to try to sort of reach evangelical Christians because of their political influence. And so they've commissioned a number of studies to look at this. For my money, those studies in many, many ways have had a very politically instrumental feel to them. They end up with messages that are sort of seem to me to be quite explicit about, we're trying to get you to vote in a certain way. And, whatever, I mean, people aren't stupid. They know when they're being sold that kind of bill of goods. And I don't think those other sort of communication approaches work terribly well. George came at it in a very different kind of way. So I'm going to share the narratives that he emerged, or that he came up with, and inflected in different ways with different scriptural or cultural references from the different traditions. He found that these messages worked on a very, very broad multi-faith scale. So the starting point was to say that the earth is a gift. What he found over and over again was that was, I guess to say it in one way, a totally non-controversial statement. And more than that, it resonated with people's experiences. And we've seen this also. We've done hundreds of interviews with people about where did their most significant spiritual or religious experience take place. And what we find over and over and over again is that about 2/3 to 3/4 of all people say that it happened outdoors somewhere. These are not deeply repressed memories that people need years of therapy to access. They are actually quite close to the surface. People have experiences of awe and of wonder and of beauty and of gratitude and of mystery and of humility and of all that and more in relationship to the natural world. Interestingly, in the United States, in a culture where it seems to me we talk about just about anything publicly, people generally do not speak about these experiences. It's considered, I think, that if you talk too much about your love for the environment, you're a little bit of a kook. In our culture, we allow people to have a conversation publicly about the beyond human world in terms of love in relationship to their pets. We're all relatively comfortable with people talking lovingly about their pets. And there's a little bit of slack cut for people to talk about their gardens in that kind of way. But you get beyond that, and people sense intuitively that if you talk about your love for the earth, you're starting to stray awfully close to that thin, invisible line that divides the sane from the insane. And people generally just don't want to go there. And yet, people have these experiences. They're easily accessible. We find most people can recall them within 5 seconds. It's the basis of this widely shared sense that the earth is a gift. So that's the starting point. Second plank in the platform, if you will, is to say that it's our responsibility to care for this gift. What we found interestingly is that the sequencing of the message matters a lot. If you start by saying it's our responsibility, you lose a fair number of people because you're asking them to jump the hurdle before they've got the head of steam up. So it's really critically important to start with the acknowledgement of the fact that it's a gift. And then, once people are connected with that inherent sense of gratitude that they have, the idea that, of course, we got to take care of it is intuitive and makes perfect sense and is quite easy to accept. And what I would say is, I've done exercises in hundreds of congregations where you invite people to talk about their experience of God outdoors. And I've done them in liberal, conservative, mixed, all kinds of different congregations. I've seen sort of Tea Party men, hunters and all of this sort of thing, in close to tears as they've talked about their gratitude for the earth, because if they hunt or if they fish, they get it. They see it. The reason they like to go hunting is because they like these experiences. And so, connect with the gift, then it's our responsibility to take care of it. That's the second piece of the picture. Again, there's more than adequate backup for that in the sacred writings of the human family. It's not a big deal. The third plank then, which is, I think George navigated in a really nifty way, is to say that things are out of balance. And he found that wording really mattered a lot, because there is this sense within religions, and just sort of deeper than religions, within human beings, that sort of balance, fairness, and you look to the East and Asia's sense of harmony is really very important. There's something in us that responds intuitively to this sense of the importance of things being in balance. And what's nice about balance is that it's not quite a binary all or nothing kind of framing. It's this sense that it acknowledges the diversity of perspectives that make up life, but it also says, if you get a little too much of one thing, that's not so good. And by talking about balance and things being out of balance in relationship to the environment, it presents this idea that there's a problem in a way that, again, is much easier for people to accept. It connects with the experience of many people who live closer to the land, who see it clearly. And it defangs the more partisan dimensions of the conversation. So the earth is a gift. It's our responsibility to care for it. Things have gotten out of balance. And then the final piece that he came up with is that we've got to wake up and do something about it. And the wake up is the key language in there. Because if you think about it, what all religions say to us one way or another is that we all have to wake up. We have to wake up to the fact that there's something bigger than us that's the heart of what life is about. Religions literally use the word awakening quite a bit, and while those of us who are pastors don't necessarily sort of translate that as colloquially as just saying wake up, that's, it's a little bit more of an everyday way to say it. And again, this idea of sort of waking up, and you can say it in a lot of different ways, is something that is again, it's not a heavy lift for folks in terms of doing it. So I've found that this sort of narrative flow, if you will, it's a gift, it's our responsibility, it's out of balance, and we got to wake up, is a really nice, sort of very easy, and to some degrees inarguable way of engaging around this. And it at least helps crack the door open a little bit. I've also found that for an awful lot of people who think of themselves as being opposed to environmental protection or opposed to action on climate change, their big beef is they think that they're against government intervention. What they care about, if you sort of parse it out carefully, is not so much that they're anti-environment, it's more that they're anti-government, or they think they're anti-government in the way that they have it constructed. And so another way to crack the door open that is I think, just to acknowledge that and to say, look, let's take the government, take Al Gore, take the government out of the picture for a minute. Do you think it's our responsibility to take care of the earth, of the natural world? And if you sort of acknowledge that hang-up in that kind of way, I find you can often sort of connect. And this is not a short-term fix. I'm Christian, and so the conversion of Paul the Apostle is often held up as a model of the ideal, where there's this sort of instantaneous conversion from one form of life and one perspective to another that's dramatically different. We all know that that's not the way that the world works for the most part, and to be honest, when it does work that way, it's often not trustworthy. And so I think that the thing that we all have to reckon with is that what changes people in the long term, over time, in my opinion, is usually not primarily narratives or messages, no matter how well crafted they are. It's relationships. It's relationships with people who they love and who they respect, with whom they have a connection that matters to them. That's what changes people. And so I think that beyond all of the narrative and the messaging and the belief side of the equation is the question of community. And that's why it's good for us to be here together today. And that's why it is good for congregations to be talking about this and thinking about this and speaking about it even when it gets tough, because people do leave congregations, but for the most part, people stick around. And the ability to have a sustained conversation about a difficult topic, or a topic which may feel difficult to people, it's what I call, in the very positive sense of this term, if that's possible, the Chinese water torture effect of congregations, which is that if you have that slow drip of communication over and over and over again, it shapes people's hearts and minds and beings. And I just flat out believe that, and my guess is that you all do too. So, you know, there's the narratives, there's the sort of the beliefs, what matters, and there's the sort of the theory of change, which is that you just doggedly stick with people until they have, in a good humor, until they have no choice but to come along with you. And I actually mean that kind of seriously, because I think that it works. So there's that. So the question then becomes, you know, what does this actually look like in real life? And how does this get incarnated and embodied and put into action? And what do we do in the midst of this sort of ridiculously awful situation that we're in now, where we've got a national federal government that is hell-bent, literally, on sort of denying findings of science, that's acting in a way that has not just a sort of environment that seems to have an animus towards this stuff that's hard to grapple with. And what I'd like to do is to tell a story about another period of time, not so far in the past, where things seemed pretty dark, and what happened as a result of that. So there was another dark interval back in 2009, 2010, in the aftermath of the failed Copenhagen climate negotiations. The world sort of had moved into those negotiations feeling that it was absolutely fundamentally important to get a climate deal in Copenhagen because the clock was ticking, time was not on our side, and the hope was, and all of the hope was put on going into that set of negotiations and reaching an international agreement that would start to limit greenhouse gas emissions, that would bend that emissions curve down, and that would put the world on the right pathway forward. And there was a very logical and coherent theory of change that led into that hope, which was that if there had been years of work to educate people about the realities of climate change, that people being rational beings would understand the importance of the issue. They would build communities of support for advocating for those changes. They would talk to their cultural and business and political leaders, and rationality would prevail. People would see the importance of it. There would be legislation on a national level all around the world, including, importantly, here in the US, because of our fundamental role in the international system. That would sort of trickle up into an international agreement, and that would be how the problem would be solved. And it's a very appealing and rational narrative about how change happens, and the governments of the world went into Copenhagen, and it utterly failed. It just did not work. The world left Copenhagen without an agreement, and not only was that devastating just on its own terms, but it was devastating because it cracked apart the narrative that people had held about how this problem was going to get solved, and that's where the dark interval reference comes in. People really felt, you know what, we've worked pretty dang hard for decades now, and it just hasn't worked, and what can we do? And the climate movement entered into a period of a couple of years of just flat-out depression, which people were having a hard time admitting, but there was just a sort of an almost deafening silence after Copenhagen because people really didn't know what to do. And there was this palpable sense of loss and of grief because the way that we thought we were going to win didn't work. And so in those dark interval moments, Crossan writes, the new emergence starts to happen in places that are incredibly difficult to predict. And so one of the places where this started to happen was in a couple of colleges in Pennsylvania, one of them being Swarthmore, where a small group of students got together, and they were fed up with the fact that their elders hadn't been able to solve this problem or even grapple with it adequately. And they said to themselves, you know what? If this institution of higher education is designed with its mission to prepare us for the future, then it has no business investing in the industry that is doing the most to destroy that future, which is the fossil fuel industry. So they did their research, and they went to the president of Swarthmore, and they said to him very clearly, we think that Swarthmore should divest from its investments in fossil fuels. They had read about the history of the divestment movement in relationship to apartheid South Africa. They thought, you know what, this applies. So they went to the president, they brought the message. The president responded to them with an almost endearing level of condescension, and said to them that, thank you very much for your inputs. You guys really should just go home and do your homework now. Let us run the ship. So they were ticked off and, you know, sort of irritated by the response that the president had. They went home. They kept on talking and kept on pushing. Nothing really happened. But about 5 or 6 months later, Bill McKibben wrote an article in Rolling Stone that went viral called The Terrifying New Math of Global Warming. And in that article, he highlighted and praised the work that these students were doing. The article took off. Within 6 months, there were 300 fossil fuel divestment chapter campaign movements on college and university campuses around the United States and beyond. And there's a wonderful line in a Leonard Cohen song about there's a crack in everything, it's where the light comes in. And this was the first crack that really opened up. Faith communities got actively and enthusiastically involved in the fossil fuel divestment movement. And the first faith-based institution internationally that divested was interesting. It was that hotbed of radicalism, the Church of Sweden, which had sort of said, with its not inconsiderable investment fund, it had said, we have cared about this issue for many, many years. We don't feel it's right for us as a church to make money from this industry anymore. We've tried shareholder advocacy with them. We've tried all kinds of stuff. It hasn't worked. And so therefore, we're going to sell our holdings, and even more, we're going to invest in renewable energy. Very rational. So they just went ahead and did it. They were followed by other groups, some of the more usual suspects like the United Church of Christ here in the United States, the Unitarian Universalist Assembly. There were any number of different colleges and universities which kept on going. Union Theological Seminary, a sort of landmark liberal Protestant seminary in New York City, took off. It was really fascinating there. One of our Green Faith Fellows who we trained through a program that we've run for a decade, I think really got that started because it was a high-profile lecture. The seminary had a very well-respected visiting scholar come in to give a lecture, and Chris, this guy that was our fellow who was very interested in seeing Union divest, he sat in the front row of the lecture. And the lecture wasn't about eco-theology or the environment or anything like that. So the first question and answer time comes. First question comes, and Chris stands up and addresses the question to the visiting lecturer and says, I'm very concerned about climate change, and I would like to know what your opinion is about fossil fuel divestment. And you could sort of see the expression of the president of the seminary like go, oh, because this was not, the seminary divested within about 5 months after that. And it wasn't only Chris doing it. To Union's credit, they get on board with this sort of stuff. But it was the willingness of someone to stand up and be counted that I think really made a difference and that sent a message sort of clearly about that, shifted the debate. University of Dayton, a Marianist Catholic university, divested, first major Catholic institution to divest. The World Council of Churches came on board. Just a couple of weeks ago, 40 Catholic religious orders and congregations and institutions announced their divestment. I think one of the more moving ones to me was last year at the climate negotiations. The Islamic, which took place in Morocco, a Muslim majority country, the Islamic community understandably has been not fast on the uptake on divestment because so much of the charitable work within the Islamic community is funded by petrodollars, and everybody knows this, it's no secret, and you don't like to bite the hand that feeds you. The Islamic Society of North America last year came out with a commitment saying that because climate change and the fossil fuel industry now embody that which is counter to our life-supporting mission and identity, we will divest from fossil fuels. It was a stunning declaration and a courageous one. So that was one sort of thing that started to happen in the wake of Copenhagen, but it wasn't limited to, fossil fuel divestment. Paul mentioned the big mobilizations that started to happen. So we were very involved in the organizing of the People's Climate March in New York City And what we saw, we had 30 different religious denominations and traditions that each had their own sort of table for organizing and mobilizing their own communities around the march. And there was just a wonderful sense of collegiality. I think it's an Irish saying. If it's not, it should be. It was, is this a private fight or can anybody get involved? And everybody was jumping on board. It was just great. And the interesting thing, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Buddhist, Baha'i, Sikh, Jain, Indigenous, all this sort of stuff. And about 3 weeks before the march, I got a phone call from one of the largest atheist groups in the United States. And they said, you've got all these different groups that have representation within your faith coalition. Why don't you have an atheist group? And I was like, I never thought you guys would have wanted it, So we created an atheist group as part of the coalition. And the funny thing there is we had a sort of drop-down menu so that people could get connected. And atheist, of course, begins with A, right? So, I'm sure we lost some donations because of that. But nonetheless, it was, and I think what that said to me was that, there's our language hasn't really caught up with what's going on here. There's something a lot bigger than all of us that's at work here, and that's good, and that people want to be together around this. The night before the march, the main organizers got together, and the clear message was that we hoped like crazy that there were going to be 100,000 people that would show up so that we wouldn't lose face, frankly, in terms of all the effort that had gone into this. And so when 400,000 people showed up the next day and marched peacefully through the streets of New York and brought a really clear message, it changed history. What we saw in the wake of that was that all of a sudden politicians realized that they could go a little bit further than they had previously been willing to go, because there were a lot of people out there who cared about this stuff, and they felt safe. If I've learned one thing through all of this stuff, it's that politicians do not lead. They follow, and they follow only when enough of us have stood up to be counted. And so don't ever doubt the value of standing up in public around this, because it's the only thing that makes change happen. We had a school bus-sized replica of Noah's Ark that we built to haul through the length of the march with a biodiesel-powered pickup truck. And on the side of the Ark, we had a sign that said, "We are all Noah now," sort of trying to send the message that it's all of us, this job to protect the community of life. And it didn't stop with the march in New York. Pope Francis issued his just incredible encyclical in June of that year, and 10 days after the march, after Pope Francis issued Laudato Si, we were able to organize a march of about 5,000 people into St. Peter's Square to thank the Pope for his witness and to show that people of all faiths were on board with this. And we were able to organize, as part of that, a training for about 120 younger faith leaders from 30 different countries who came together to study and learn together so that they could go back to their countries and lead on these issues. And so when the march came, it was a wonderful sort of rainbow coalition of different religious groups, all of the different traditions that I'd mentioned earlier, and these wonderful sort of signs and banners and floats. In the march in New York, there had been 6 or 7 of these beautiful kites of birds with about a 7 or 8 foot wingspan on a 30-foot bamboo pole, and you wave them back and forth. They sort of soar back and forth through the air. So we had 6 or 7 of them in New York, and we got a hold of the guy who made them from New York, who worked for the Muppets, and he made 30 of them for us for Rome. And so we were marching down the equivalent of the Fifth Avenue of Rome, the Corso Vittorio Emanuele. 30 of these birds going through the air. It was absolutely spectacular. If you ever go on a march as part of a multi-faith group, you got to march with the Hare Krishnas, because they dance the whole time. So in the middle of a long march that can get kind of boring after a while, they're dancing and they got their bells going. Really, really wonderful. So we'd been told by the Vatican security that we weren't going to be able to come into St. Peter's Square with our signs and banners, and I get that, because there are security concerns and you don't want to get anybody bonked on the head with a 2x4. So we figured we had this plan that we were going to fan out and sort of surround St. Peter's Square. We approached St. Peter's Square about 150 yards out, and the Swiss Guard guy comes marching out in those wonderful, ridiculous costumes. And he said to us that we could come in, because word had come down kind of literally from on high that we were welcome. And we'd been in sort of back-channel communications with the Vatican, so they knew we were coming. And we marched into St. Peter's Square. Again, like I said, you know, Muslim, Hindu, Jew, Christian, Sikh, Baha'i, Jain, everything. Everybody in traditional religious clothing. So it was not an incognito interfaith event. It was sort of wide open. You know, the Hare Krishna's dancing right into St. Peter's Square, right? You know, and the Pope comes out on his balcony and says his blessing, and then goes off script and thanks the people who are assembled. He says, "Thank you to people of different faiths for your care and concern for our common home." So at that point, the Catholic members of our group, a number of them burst into tears, because they didn't know that they'd live to see the day where their leader would act with such wonderful hospitality. The Hare Krishnas are there dancing the whole way through. A young Jewish guy was standing next to me, and he said, "I'm a Jew from Brooklyn, and I just walked into St. Peter's Square with my new friends, the Hare Krishnas, and the Pope came out and thanked us." And it was, again, one of those moments where we all realized there's something much, much bigger than us that's going on. Things went on, the Paris Climate Agreement got signed, and, you know, now we are where we are. And I want to say that if I've learned anything from this, it is that it is important to find a way to act that is unapologetic about what you believe in and where you stand, and not to soft pedal it, and to go for it. Because conviction, anybody who's a preacher or a pastor knows that how you say something is every bit as important, if not more important, than what you say. And what the world needs to see and needs to experience is our conviction, and the fact that we believe deeply that this is the pathway that God has called for us to walk, and that we will not stand down, and that we will persevere, because we are doing what is right. We are protecting a gift for which it is our responsibility to care, and that gift is out of balance, and it's time for the world to wake up. So I have done what I swore to you at the beginning of time, the beginning of this session I promised you that I would not do, which is to talk for an awfully long time. And thanks to Paul for sort of getting up and sort of reminding me that things need to go on. And I really am sorry about that, because I don't like to go on at the length that I have. I really do like the back and forth. And in
We've got 10 minutes.
Oh, really? All right. So good. All right. Well, that's good. I thought my watch is a little bit fast then.
I just wanted to make sure we got to that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for saving a New Yorker from himself. That's a good thing. So why don't we stop there? And I'd love to hear questions, thoughts, feedback, agreements, disagreements, whatever. But more than anything else, congratulations to you all for coming together in these numbers. And for God's sake, don't be shy about what you believe in and why you're here, because it's very difficult to overstate the importance of addressing these issues, and the time is short. So many thanks, and I'd be glad to hear from you all. Yes, ma'am. And maybe would it be good, Paul, if people stood up and introduced themselves and said what congregation they're from? Would that be good for folks to hear?
Sure. My name's Ann Coble, and I'm from St. Augustine's here in Nashville. And I just wanted to make a comment and see if you know the answer to this. I think Swarthmore did eventually divest. Is that right?
Nope. The irony of it is that they started the whole thing moving in many ways, and they still have not divested. I believe it. So it's interesting. It's an interesting thing about what does victory, success mean. You know, I mean, look at all the good they did, and yet. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, Dan Trico with Interfaith Power and Light. I remember another dark interval. Paul was very involved in this, which was in the 80s. There was a lot of concern about nuclear war and the nuclear freeze movement. And in many ways, I think that ended the Cold War. And I could go through the history of all of that. But it seemed like something that was never going to end this conflict with the Soviet Union. And there's a lot to be said that opened the door to the possibility of this breakdown of the Cold War. So just want to make that comment.
No, I think it's a really good point. And I think it's, we're in this situation where it doesn't, despair doesn't do much good for anybody. And at the same point in time, if you don't, if you don't sort of reckon seriously, I mean, look at all the, you guys have read about and seen all the images of these storms that have happened. I mean, it's your heart breaks. And at the end of the day, to me, that's one of the things that I think is not cool about the polarization that's happened. Is at the end of the day, what climate change does is it ruins people's lives. It creates trauma. It dispossesses and displaces, huge numbers of people. It deprives them of their homes and of their communities. And I think that's, that's why, again, I think it's, we've got to have the courage of our convictions to sort of say, look, this can't go on. I want to make sure I get different parts of the room. Ma'am, go ahead.
I'm Catherine Bomboy from St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church. Thank you for speaking with us this morning. As you so eloquently said earlier, politicians don't lead, they follow. Within the faith community, who's doing a good job of leading this charge to communicate to the politicians that actually make the policy about why we need to take action about climate change?
So the question was, politicians follow who's within faith communities who's doing a good job of sort of raising this to politicians' awareness. So, compared to 15 years ago, there are a reasonable number of groups now that are doing good work on this. So Interfaith Power and Light is doing good work. We're doing good work. The Catholic Climate Covenant is doing good work. The Franciscan Action Network, Hazon, which is a Jewish environmental organization, the Global Catholic Climate Movement, the Alliance for Religions and Conservation, which is based in the UK, the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, One Earth. I mean, there are. Excuse me. Slow down. Yeah, there are a lot of groups, and I think rather than naming sort of 10 or so more, which I could do, I think that we're at a stage now where. And religious groups sometimes get nervous about this, but what this is about is it's about projecting and demonstrating power. And that's one of the reasons that we've stayed very involved with and helped lead the People's Climate Movement, because we believe that the only way that we'll be able to develop the power to get what we need is with a coalition between environmentalists and people of faith and students and workers, that the powers that we're up against require a coalition approach. And so I think that, there's going to be, Governor Brown in California has announced this climate summit in 2018. And while the state of California doesn't really have very well-formed plans about what they want to do at the summit, we have a pretty well-formed plan already, which is that we want people in the street all over the world. And that was the same thing that happened in 2014. I mean, Ban Ki-moon called the climate summit in 2014 in large part because he wanted to create an occasion for civil society to come out in force. Because he was smart and he understood that you can stick diplomats in a room forever and maybe nothing happens. But if you get large numbers of people in the streets, so I think it's important to think strategically. I mean, we were talking last night about what do you do given that there's only so many hours in a day. I think building those kinds of coalitions is a very strategic use of time and energy, because I think it leads to numbers and it leads to a shared understanding of what the issues are about and helps create change. So, yes, ma'am.
Irene Boyd from St. Joseph's Catholic Church. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate this idea, how much I appreciate this format that you've talked about in terms of the process of working with people, building the relationships, dealing with their core values. Because I think I'm one of those people who just thinks, this is so obvious, people are just rational, we'd be different. Yeah. So I just appreciate this possibility of a way to approach a lot of people who aren't where at least I am in terms of my own convictions.
You know, I mean, thanks. I think it's really maddening and hard to understand how to deal with so much climate skepticism. I mean, what's weird is that we're just about the only country in the world that has that kind of virus. And so it's really, you know, it's really difficult. And I've gotten to the point where, you know, I don't think it's worth spending too much time trying to argue it head on. I mean, you just say, look, I just flat out disagree with you. I think you're, you know, I just think you're flat wrong, and let's agree, you know, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. Because, but I do think there's that sort of, there's folks in the middle that it's important to engage. And like I said, I mean, how many people here are pastors or rabbis or clergy or, I mean, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I've learned as a preacher is that, like I said, is how you say something is, you know, matters as much as what you say. And I do think that, I think that, you know, the cultural and religious right, in my opinion, has done a very, very effective job of communicating with conviction. And I think that as people in the sort of moderate and progressive end of the spectrum, I think we need to step up our game and be, you know, I think the danger of relying too much on the sort of let's find the right words is that at the end of the day, you run the risk of sort of thinking you've got to water down your message. And you obviously can't be sort of just wild-eyed, you know, total, you know, out in the left wing for everybody. But I do think that having a pretty strong position and bringing that message with conviction, I don't think it hurts to let people know where we stand. So, go back into the center now. Ma'am in the back.
Arlene Wilson from Christ Church Cathedral here in Nashville. I'm really struck with the age here. Where are the kids coming along who really need us and our energy to fix this problem? And so it's a real imperative now, I see, that we have to do this for our as parents and grandparents, or for the young. Except for a few exceptions, we are, you know, the over 40 crowd, maybe the 50. So I get busy.
Well, and I think, yeah, the question was, you know, how to engage with younger generation millennials, and which is a really, I mean, we've started with a lot of our training programs to focus them almost exclusively on millennials. And I think I find a couple of things. One is, and this is not news to those of you who are here, a lot of the historical denominations are not the places where a lot of younger folks are going to church, speaking just from a church or synagogue. I mean, it's the same phenomenon. And I used to think this was just first I used to think it was just an Episcopal problem, then I thought it was just a mainline Protestant problem, then I thought it was just a US problem. You know, we have a Hindu program in India. It's the same issue there. They're really wrestling with how do you engage younger Hindus in India around these things. I think what we do is we try to go where folks are. It's, you know, you go to the emergent churches, you find different ways of approaching this stuff, and it takes commitment and perseverance. Doesn't happen easily or overnight. And it's the same thing, frankly, with racial diversity. I mean, it's, you know, the religious environmental movement's been very white. You know, largely middle to upper middle class, which mirrors in many ways the environmental movement. And that's again where the coalition approach, working with labor unions and with a wider coalition, has been, I think, really fundamental. Because until you understand how do you talk about, well, let me put it this way, put it in the positive. I remember one of my favorite floats at the Climate March in New York was not any of the environmental floats, it was a labor union float. It was a float that had these two sort of, you know, it was a very labor feel to it. It had two muscular workers sort of putting up a wind turbine. And the big banner on the side of the float said, "Labor is ready and able." And I thought that was so cool in terms of the, you know, the sort of a new kind of message. So I think that it's not just youth. It's thinking about how do we talk about what this is about in a way that's deep and fundamental for a lot of different people. No, how are we doing, Paul? One more? Or?
We can take one more.
One more? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Ann Cover from Nashville. I'm a United Methodist pastor, and I want to speak to your comment. I think there are numbers and numbers of younger people who have sort of given up on those of us that are older. who have given up on some of us who are older and the older institutions, and they've already made up, they're pro-climate, and they're waiting for us to take a and that's the way it feels sometimes. Yeah. And so they would just love to, and I know we've been in so many of the other movements, but it's still, again, our time to lead because we're the ones with the gray hair.
Well, and I think it's, I mean, there's definitely a generational divide on this. Even within, I mean, the polling is clear even within the evangelical community, which people think of as being quite conservative. You know, evangelicals over 55, the moral priorities are gay marriage and abortion. Under 35, it's poverty and care for creation, care for the environment. It's a top priority. And then you've got the swing generation in the middle. That said, I think, I think we all need, I mean, it's that Irish saying, and we all need to weigh in. And I do think, like was the case in the 80s with the nuclear movement. There were a lot of seasoned sort of 60s activists who were active in that. There were a lot of younger people. That's where I certainly feel like I cut my teeth in terms of organizing and mobilizing work. So I think the more we find a way to celebrate a big, diverse community, the better. So thank you all very, very much. It's great to be with you.
Thank you, Fletcher. He just got back from Germany just a couple of days ago. He's stayed very, very busy, and thank you so much for coming down here today.